Hello, and welcome to Saddle and Sixskin, the channel for those of us who appreciate the grit and grandeur of the Old West, especially you folks over 40 who know a thing or two about life's hard lessons. If you're new here, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Today, we're diving into a tale of survival, resilience, and unexpected connection amidst a brutal winter. Have you ever wondered what it took to just live in those days? Well, settle in, grab a cup of coffee, and let's explore this gripping story together. Snow swept across the plains in waves, transforming the landscape into a desolate white sea that seemed to have consumed the earth. The only signs of human presence were scattered fragments of fence posts and the jagged outline of a barn's roof, stark reminders that someone, at some point, had attempted to tame this unforgiving land. The wind roared with a voice that echoed from before the dawn of memory, shaking the weather-beaten boards of the barn until they groaned like weary bones, each creak a testament to their long, hard existence. Inside the barn, the air was thick with a strange mixture of scents, the comforting smell of hay, the metallic tang of blood, and the biting chill that found its way through every crack and crevice. A single lantern swung precariously from a beam, its flame dancing and flickering against the draft, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to kneel in reverence beside the wounded woman sprawled on the straw. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each breath wet with the crimson that stained her blouse, a grim marker of her desperate struggle. She had dragged herself here through the raging blizzard, driven by something far stronger than the pain that gnawed at her body. Her children clung tightly to her hands, still warm, their small frames shaking uncontrollably, not only from the biting cold but also from the crushing fear that threatened to overwhelm their young hearts. The girl, her face pressed against her brother's shoulder, cried in muffled sobs, each one a tiny expression of her terror and grief. The boy, barely a year older, tried his best to hold her steady, his own lips quivering with suppressed emotion. His eyes, though, betrayed the same terror he fought so hard to conceal, reflecting the overwhelming dread that hung heavy in the air. The barn door shuddered violently under the relentless force of the wind. And then, without warning, it groaned open, torn from its latch by the storm. A gust of icy air swept through the opening, scattering snow across the straw-covered floor, a further invasion of the harsh elements into their fragile shelter. What happens next? Remember to like and subscribe, if you want to know what happens to them. The figure silhouetted in the doorway filled the opening like a dark shadow against the flickering lantern light. He had broad shoulders, his coat was rimmed with frost, and his beard was caked in ice. He did not speak immediately. His eyes, a quiet gray hardened by years of solitude, slowly took in the scene before him, a woman barely clinging to life, two children on the brink of losing everything. Blood stained the straw like ink spilled across the first page of a tragic story. He stepped inside, pushing the heavy door closed against the storm's relentless assault, though the wind clawed at it, desperate to follow him inside. For a moment, silence descended, as thick and heavy as the snow outside. The only sound was the woman's ragged breathing, a low, rattling rasp that seemed to measure out time itself. He knelt beside her, his hands rough and scarred, hands used to the hard work of cutting wood and cleaning rifles, not tending to delicate wounds. Yet, something in the way the children stared at him, their eyes pleading without words, evoked a tenderness that had long lain dormant within him, like embers hidden beneath layers of ash. He pressed his palm against her wound, feeling the warmth of her blood against his skin, sticky and disturbingly alive, reminding him that death had not yet claimed her. The woman's eyes fluttered open just enough for her to catch a glimpse of him, and for a fleeting moment, her gaze was steady, unwavering despite the shadows creeping at the edges of her vision. The children shrank back initially, wary of the stranger, but the boy straightened when he saw the man's movements were careful and deliberate, not cruel or menacing. The girl clung even tighter to her brother, her tears gleaming in the soft lantern light. The man looked at them briefly, his voice a gravelly rumble when he finally spoke. "Keep close. She'll need you near." The words settled into the barn as if they had been carved into the very beams. The boy nodded, though his throat was too tight to speak. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded beast denied its prey. The storm pressed relentlessly against the barn walls, but inside, another storm raged, quieter, more desperate, the battle between life and death hanging heavy in the air under the weight of the man's blood-stained hands. Have you ever faced a situation that demanded all you had to give? That's the kind of moment we're witnessing here, the point where ordinary people are pushed to extraordinary acts. And if you're finding this story compelling, be sure to subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. We've got plenty more tales just like this one coming your way. Let's get back to the story. He searched her face, seeing the deep lines etched by grief and hardship. This woman was no stranger to suffering, but she had somehow managed to endure, to carry on until this night. A memory flickered unbidden across his mind. Another face, pale and fading. Another promise he had failed to keep years ago, on some distant battlefield. His jaw tightened. Not again. He would not let history repeat itself. The woman stirred, her lips parting as if to speak, but only a faint breath escaped, as fragile as smoke. Her children leaned in, desperate for any sound from her. He felt her pulse faltering beneath his touch. Quickly, he tore a strip of fabric from his own shirt, pressing it firmly against her wound, the heat of her blood soaking it almost instantly. His hands remained steady, but inside, something raw and unrelenting began to stir, a resolve he had thought long buried beneath years of silence. The boy whispered, his voice trembling, will she? He couldn't finish the question, as if uttering the word, die, would somehow hasten its arrival. The man met the boy's eyes, gray meeting wide, fearful blue, and he refused to lie. She's fighting, he said, his voice softer, almost to himself, and I'll fight with her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The lantern flame quivered, casting long, dancing shadows across the rafters. The children, exhausted by terror, leaned against each other, their eyelids heavy, but they stubbornly refused to relinquish their grip on their mother's hand. The man worked in silence, his breath rising in the frigid air, his movements patient and relentless. Outside, the storm showed no mercy, but inside this barn, mercy was demanded. At last, her breathing seemed to stabilize, still shallow but less jagged, like a thread no longer on the verge of snapping. He did not lift his hands, not trusting the fragile calm. His shoulders burned with exhaustion, but he refused to yield. He looked at her again, really looked at her, not as a stranger who had stumbled into his barn, but as a woman who had carried burdens he recognized in his own bones, a widow marked by loss, yet still alive enough to be worth saving. The girl whispered suddenly, breaking the fragile hush. "Don't let Mama go." Her words cut through the stillness sharper than any blade, piercing the man's resolve and anchoring him even deeper. He closed his eyes for the briefest moment, then opened them again with the weight of a vow not yet spoken but already carved into his chest. Do you think we always get a chance to fulfill our vows? What do you think of this man right now? Be sure to let us know in the comments section below. Now, let's see what happens next. Snow still drifted in through the cracks in the wood. The storm showed no signs of relenting, but something had shifted within the man, as if the blizzard outside had forced him into a reckoning. His solitude had long been his shield, but now it was breached by the sight of two children clinging to hope and a woman's life slipping away beneath his hands. He realized that the silence he had chosen all these years had left him with nothing worth losing, and here, suddenly, was everything. The woman's eyes flickered open again, this time with more awareness. They found his face in the dim light, reading the truth there, even as her lips struggled to form words. His hand pressed firmer, holding the thin line between her and the encroaching darkness. Her son's small voice rose once more, steadier than before, as if he sensed a subtle shift. "You won't leave us, will you?" The man did not answer immediately. He looked at the boy, then at the girl, then back to the woman gasping for breath beneath his palms. The lantern light caught in his eyes, turning the gray almost silver. He drew in a deep breath, heavy with the weight of all that had come before and all that was yet to come. And though his voice was low, barely more than a whisper, it filled the barn like a promise carved into stone. "Not tonight. And as the wind howled outside, the children clung tighter to their mother, the woman's breathing steadied, and the barn held its breath as though it too was waiting to hear what he would vow next. So, will he stay? Or will he leave? If you don't want to miss it, hit the like button and subscribe. The storm raged on through the night, a ceaseless chorus of moans pressed against the timber walls. Inside, the barn existed in a world apart, suspended between life and death. The lantern's flame had burned low, a single trembling beacon warding off the encroaching darkness. The man sat cross-legged on the straw, his hand still pressed against the makeshift bandage he had tied, his gaze fixed on the woman's chest, watching it rise and fall in a shallow rhythm. Each breath was a fragile victory, though every pause between them carried a threat of despair. The children lay curled close by, their small bodies draped in old blankets he had pulled from a corner. Sleep had finally come for them, not in peace, but in sheer exhaustion, their faces streaked with the salt of tears that had dried too soon. He studied them in the dim light, their vulnerability stirring memories he had long tried to suppress, a battlefield soaked in blood, men he had called brothers slipping away into silence. He had sworn to himself that he would never again hold another life in his hands, never again feel the crushing weight of failing someone who trusted him. Yet here fate had conspired against his vow. This woman was not kin, not comrade, but something in her unwavering breath, in her refusal to surrender despite her grievous wound, demanded that he defy death itself. She stirred, a low sound escaping her lips, a sound born not only of pain but of memories pressed too close. He leaned in, his ear near her mouth, but her words were fragmented, disjointed. A name, perhaps, or a plea. Her eyes fluttered open, her pupils searching as if she were still half dreaming. For an instant, they focused on him with startling clarity. She seemed to measure him, to weigh the truth of his presence. Then her eyelids lowered again, and silence reclaimed her. Dawn crept slowly across the horizon, pale light filtering through the cracks in the barn, painting the interior in muted shades of gray. Outside, snow lay heavy upon the earth, a suffocating shroud over every fence post and tree. He rose stiffly, his body aching from hours spent bent at her side. He moved to the door, cautiously cracked it open against the weight of the snow, and gazed out at the whitewashed landscape. The storm had passed, but its silence was no more forgiving. In this harsh land, silence meant distance, distance meant danger, and danger meant the razor-thin line between survival and utter ruin. When he turned back, he saw the boy watching him, wide-eyed, though he had not moved from his sister's side. The boy did not speak at first, as if he was weighing whether his voice would be welcome. At last, he whispered, "She's not going to die, is she?" The words were small, yet they pierced with the weight of faith, placed where no faith had been asked. The man knelt, meeting the child's gaze, and though the truth clawed at him, he said, "Only, she is still here. That is enough for now." The boy nodded, clinging to the man's answer like driftwood in a storm. The girl stirred next, rubbing her eyes raw from weeping. She clutched her brother's arm, then looked toward the man, her expression caught between fear and fragile trust. "Mama always said, help doesn't come," she whispered, her voice thin as frost. "But you came." Her words left a hollow, ringing in his chest. He had never intended to be anyone's savior, only a shadow moving across the land unseen. Yet, here he was, pulled from his solitude by chance, or perhaps by some cruel twist of fate. Hours bled into one another. He tended the fire he had built in a rusted iron pan, feeding it with splinters he had gathered from broken crates. He boiled water and coaxed warmth back into the children's small, frozen hands. The woman drifted in and out of a fevered half-sleep, her whispers filled with fragments of the past. From them, he gleaned glimpses of her life, fields she had planted with her own hands, a husband's voice that had grown harsh with drink, neighbors whose kindness had soured when hardship stretched on too long. He heard no bitterness in her words, only a weary strength that had carried her farther than most would have managed. As the day lengthened, he found himself thinking of those neighbors, the scattered farms lying silent beneath the snow. Some would turn their faces away if asked for help, hiding behind scripture or scarcity. Others might offer pity, but pity never filled a hungry belly. He knew this world too well. It often gave nothing, and it often took everything. By late afternoon, the woman's breathing had grown steadier, though her skin burned with fever. He changed the bandage, his hands moving with a careful precision as though each movement bore the weight of a sacred promise. When her eyes opened once more, they lingered on him longer than before. This time, she spoke, her voice cracked but firm. Why? One word only, yet filled with all the suspicion of a life bruised by disappointment. He hesitated. The easy answers were duty, or chance, or the simple act of being there. But those words rang hollow in his mouth. At last, he said, because you were not meant to face this night alone. She studied him intently, and though she did not reply, her gaze softened, as if something deep within her recognized the truth beyond the words. The children clung closer to her then, as though reassured by her fleeting strength. He saw in them not frailty, but an unyielding will, a reflection of their mother's spirit pressed into their small bones. And in that recognition, he felt a subtle shift within himself, a stirring of responsibility that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. Night crept in again, the shadows gathering in the corners of the barn. He stoked the lantern, its glow carving the space into islands of gold against the encroaching darkness. The children settled at their mother's side, whispering prayers in voices too quiet to reach heaven, yet loud enough to carve themselves into his heart. He sat apart, yet never far, his rifle across his knees, listening to the groan of the timbers, the sigh of the snow, the fragile symphony of survival. But silence brought no peace. In the stillness, his thoughts returned to his own past, to the choices that had exiled him to solitude. The faces of men he could not save haunted him, their eyes closing forever under his watch. He had vowed then to carry no one else, to bear only his own shadow across the land. And yet, here lay a woman and her children, pressing against the walls of his vow until they threatened to crumble. The weight of their presence bore down on him heavier than any snowfall. Yet, he found that he did not shrink from it. The woman stirred once more, her hand lifting weakly before falling back. He caught it, his rough palm enveloping her fragile fingers. She met his eyes again, her whisper faint as breath. "Promise me." He froze, his heart pounding. She did not need to finish the sentence. The plea was clear, carried in the eyes of her children, in the tremor of her lips, in the silence of the barn that seemed to hold its breath. He tightened his grip, the words forming slowly, reluctantly, yet inevitably, as dawn. But before he could speak them, the lantern sputtered, casting the barn into brief darkness. The children stirred, the girl whimpering, and in that shadowed pause, the weight of what he was about to vow pressed down on him with a force that left him trembling. The flame caught again, light flaring across his face. He drew in a breath, the promise trembling on the edge of breaking free. And in that moment, he knew that once the words were spoken, nothing would ever be the same. The barn no longer felt like the same place it had been on that first night of blood and storm. The air still held the bite of winter, and the wind still found its way through the cracks in the boards, but something softer lingered now, as if the straw and timbers themselves had drawn closer around the wounded woman and her children. The lantern's glow no longer seemed desperate, but steady, casting warmth over pale faces and exhausted eyes. The promise hung heavy and quiet as a new blanket of snow. What happens next? Tune in soon, and remember to like and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin.